Hi, Talia. Hi, Michael. How are you guys?
Good, how are you? Sorry, excuse me not having my camera on. I'm just eating my lunch.
Yeah, no problem at all. You don't need to have your camera on. That's absolutely cool. I'll just get my settings all sorted out here. Bear with me. I got your question too, Talia. We'll cover that at the end.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Well, I'm going to make a start because this is going to be recorded. So if anyone joins in late, they get to watch the recording. So welcome to Blister Prevention Office Hours. This is just going to be a regular thing every month where I'm going to jump online for half an hour and give you the opportunity to ask any questions about blisters. So you can, by all means, ask away at any point during this. You could either pop your questions in the chat box or turn your microphone on, or you would have noticed also that you got the opportunity to ask a question at the time of registration. So we've got 4 questions from that. So we'll go through those at the end. So yeah, we're going to talk about, I guess, something topical. Hopefully the weather's getting warm soon because it's not here. But moisture management can be a topical blister prevention factor in summer. And that is basically because we know that dry skin has a lower friction level, and that is advantageous for blister prevention. And conversely, the hotter it is and the more humid it is, the sweatier our feet get, the higher the skin friction and the more propensity for blisters. So really, moisture management is all about aiming for dry skin. Now, all the moisture management strategies, and we're only going to be looking at the ones that are internal sources of moisture, so basically perspiration. We're not going to be talking about keeping the water out of the shoe. So we're talking about reducing the effect of perspiration, and they all the moisture management strategies work via one of these mechanisms. And do you know which one it is? It's actually it's in the bottom left-hand corner. They all reduce the coefficient of friction. They're trying to make it more slippery. So that might sound a bit weird, but if we refresh our memory as to what causes blisters, it's repetitive shear deformation. So the bone is moving back and forth within the foot. That's normal. That happens with every step that we take, and it kind of has to be that way. Conversely, the skin doesn't move. So high friction forces keep the skin surface, the sock and the shoe all in stationary contact for a prolonged period of time. The higher the friction force, the longer they stay still. So the skin is still, the bone's moving back and forth, and everything between skin and bone has to stretch and distort. So moisture management strategies are all about releasing the skin surface so that it can move in sync with the bone at an earlier moment. So the bone's moving that way. We want to reduce this friction force so this gets to slide a bit sooner, and therefore it reduces the magnitude of that shear distortion. So every time we're able to reduce that magnitude of shear, the rupture that happens within the epidermis, within the stratum spinosum, is a bit further away. So we're a bit further away from blister formation. So yeah, we're essentially trying to make things more slippery. And these are the moisture management strategies we'll just quickly go over, just from a really high level. So the first one is changing out of wet socks. Everyone kind of knows this, so I'd like to think that they do as far as your patients are concerned, but maybe they don't. So, you know, if they're carrying a backpack, just to take a spare pair of socks is a good idea, depending on what they're doing. One thing to maybe mention to them is that their insoles could get wet. So if they're really sweaty, and if it's kind of there's an endurance component to this activity, then they should probably try and get their insoles out of their shoe so it can dry out. So, you know, changing into dry socks, it's good, but it has its limitations. It's not kind of going to be the be all and end all. Moisture wicking socks are a good idea. So moisture wicking socks, their aim is to get the moisture from the skin surface and to distribute it throughout that sock layer as much as possible. It's not so much, you know, socks can only do so much with regard to moisture management. So at some point, there's going to be too much moisture for the sock to be able to do anything with. But basically, we're trying to get the moisture away from the skin surface into the sock and then through to the other side of the sock. So hopefully it can evaporate through to the outside of the shoe. Obviously, to do that, we need a ventilated shoe upper. So the more ventilated it is, the more this is going to work. So the mesh upper of joggers is good, but compare that to a leather boot, you know, boots worn by miners and farmers, and also waterproofing materials like Gore-Tex. They're all things that can impede the movement of water vapor through the upper. So again, moisture wicking socks are limited in themselves, but still really important to make some effort in regard to moisture management, and will be augmented by the right kind of shoe. Toe socks are a moisture management strategy for the interdigital spaces. So normally we've got like a skin-on-skin interface there, but now all of a sudden we've got 2 layers of sock at each interdigital space. So the sock has the ability to deal with that moisture. So if your patient is really only being bothered by interdigital blisters, then simply changing to toe socks could be all that they need to do. There's a couple of things that we need to take into account, though. We've got 2, 4, 6, 8 layers of sock now, where normally there wasn't any. So that actually increases bulk substantially in the toe box. And some people are kind of at capacity for room in the toe box anyway. This can sometimes tip it over the edge. So then all of a sudden pressure becomes a bigger issue. So that's worth keeping in mind. And also if there's a swelling component, if they're on their feet all day, if it's a multi-day hike or bushwalk or running race, swelling can be a massive issue, and just take toe socks out of the equation. So, you know, all of these things have their pros and cons. Antiperspirants, the effect here is intuitive. You know, the less the feet sweat, the less moisture. The problem is the research shows that antiperspirants don't work, or at least the antiperspirants that do work, they also cause significant irritant dermatitis, so much so that it's just not worth using them. And when they added emollients to the antiperspirant, the irritant dermatitis went away, but so did the blister prevention effect. So as it stands at the moment, antiperspirants don't work as a blister prevention. I would suggest, if you really want to have an impact on moisture, let's say your patient's really, really sweaty, probably direct them towards iontophoresis. So there's no research at all in regards to whether this works for blister prevention, but I think it probably has the best effect on reducing perspiration. It's not something that you just kind of implement like the day before or the day of. It's a bit of an ordeal and a bit of a process. They need to buy equipment. It takes sort of weeks to months for it to have an effect. And I don't think the effect is forever. They need to keep doing it. But from what I understand, it actually helps reduce perspiration quite a bit. Astringents, there's absolutely no research on this as to a blister prevention, but they have an intuitive effect in that they have a drying effect on the skin. So I kind of think of astringents as, yes, they will help you start with skin that's a bit drier, but they don't stop perspiration. So it won't be long and the feet will be hot and sweaty and clammy and not the dry skin that we kind of need for blister prevention and low friction levels. So they have their place, and it's important that you know about these, because a lot of your patients might be using them and then kind of at their wits' end as to why they're not working. And it kind of makes sense. They're not magical. And finally, powders are they work more as a dry lubricant rather than a moisture management strategy, because although talc and starch powders absorb water, they don't absorb much. And when they do absorb water, they turn into a paste, and that paste can be abrasive and irritating and end up kind of contributing to skin damage. So there is one powder, though, that is different to the rest, and that is 2-Tom's Blister Shield powder. It is made out of PTFE, which is polytetrafluoroethylene, which is the same stuff that Engo patches are made out of, but obviously they're in a sheet form. And 2-Tom's Blister Shield powder is highly hydrophobic, so it doesn't absorb any water at all. And if that's what you want to use, or you want to direct your patient to use, just also remind them that it distributes into the sock, so you kind of need to reapply it. So yeah, as far as moisture management, they're the basics of our strategies that we have available to us. But there's one more internally generated moisture source, and that is blister fluid itself. It's one reason why you might consider lancing a blister rather than leaving it intact, because if you just take your chances that that blister is going to remain intact and it doesn't, then you've got all this blister fluid in the sock against the skin and potentially on the insole, and maceration like this could become a big issue. And maceration is a terrible thing to deal with. There's really no treatment other than just taking your shoes and socks off and letting your feet dry, and it's not going to happen kind of in 24 hours. It needs a prolonged period. So maceration is definitely worth avoiding. And that's just one thing that we often don't think about. So with regard to moisture management, we're trying to get dry skin to affect the low friction level, but in reality, and in summer, you know, when we're exercising, think about it, our feet are wrapped up in shoes and socks, it's hot and it's humid and we're exercising. Is the skin ever really the kind of dry that equates to low friction levels? I would say it's not, or at least it's not for very long. So I tend to just accept that the fact that the skin is going to be clammy and kind of sticky and high friction. There's going to be high friction levels in the shoe and the sock because of the presence of perspiration. And I just look for other opportunities to affect lower friction levels, or even just other blister prevention strategies. So there's tons of things that we can do. We've only looked at these ones down here, and we've only looked at the moisture management strategies. There are other strategies down here too. But, you know, depending on where the blister is, we've got other things that we can go on with that arguably provide better blister prevention power. And I'd like to suggest that if you want to get really good at blisters, that you think more about blisters not as a single entity, but as according to the anatomical location, because although every blister is caused by repetitive shear deformation, and that is the bones are moving back and forth and the skin isn't, there are different factors that are leading to that repetitive shear deformation. It has a lot to do with biomechanics, foot structure, foot function, etc. So really get anatomically specific. If you want a bit of an introduction to this, and because you haven't really thought of it this way, then I would suggest that you head to our course site, so courses.blister-prevention.com, and we have the free CPD. So that is a repeat of a webinar I did and some other free stuff. That gives you a bit of grounding on this, what causes blisters per anatomical location, how to prevent them, all that kind of stuff. And if you can see that there's value in that, and you really see that we've got to be thinking about blisters in regard to their anatomical location, get hold of the Blister Prevention University, because that's what we focus on. We look at all the pros and cons of each of the strategies. We talk about how they work, their pros and cons, and all the research behind them. And also all of the blister sites, and I'll show you what works best where. So that kind of wraps things up. We're going to do the Q&A in a sec, but let me just, I want to put this, we're really hoping that we can get your feedback on something. And we've got this little survey that we'd love to have you contribute to. And it doesn't take long, so it won't be all that dramatic, and we're giving you the chance to win an Ango combo pack, and that's about $85 or so, and a great little thing to have in your clinical drawer. So let me just pop that in the chat. I can figure out how to do that. Bear with me. Here we are. There we are. If you're able to give us some feedback on that, we would really, really appreciate it. But in the meantime, let's go through some questions. I can see there's no questions in the chat at the moment. So Talia, your question in regard to cork Birkenstocks or rubber thongs, best footwear for blister-prone people. It depends on where the blister is. So if we're talking about blisters at the back of the heel, I hate to oversimplify this, but basically either of those shoes will be fine because they're not contributing to it at all. But I'm going to assume that you're talking about blisters under the ball of the foot. I think in terms of, thongs, if the foot is having to do anything to hold that shoe on, like thongs do often, your toes claw, that makes the metatarsal head stick out more. So that is not good for blisters under the ball of the foot. So I would suggest that's not a good option. Birkenstocks tend to have more of an upper, and they're also a bit adjustable. So I would think that of the two, that would be better. And I don't know, Talia, if you're referring to or thinking about the shear modulus of the material. So if you think about like gel toe sleeves, for example, they undergo shear, and that means there's less that needs to occur within the foot. So I would suggest, and I've had a look online but can't find the answer, which is understandable. I don't know the shear modulus exactly for each of the materials, so the rubber of thongs or the cork of Birkenstocks. I would suggest maybe that the rubber of thongs undergoes a bit more shear than the Birkenstocks, but that's just a pure guess. Each of these shoes we wear without socks. Socks in themselves are a blister prevention strategy. So I would say if someone's really blister prone and having trouble with blisters, and spending a lot of time on their feet in these shoes, I would say neither of these shoes are a great idea for someone that's blister prone. I'd be getting into something where you wear a sock, something that's got a strap or closed in around the back of the heel, because that means that the toes are having to do less of this to keep it on. Yeah, so feel free to chime in if there's another part to that question, Talia, and I'll be happy to answer it.
No, all good. Thank you very much.
No worries. Okay, Marianne asked, what type of dressing to use on open blisters to prevent ulceration in diabetic patients? When it comes to blisters, there's two types of dressings. It's basically island dressings, which is essentially a Band-Aid. And you can put that on any blister whatsoever. The other is a hydrocolloid, so Compeed, for example. And we only use that on D-roof blisters. I'm sorry, I was just wondering if I was sharing my screen, but I am, thankfully. So, yeah, I don't think being diabetic necessarily changes anything. However, if that person is neuropathic, has ischemia, then that might change things. But remember, a blister base is within the stratum spinosum. So it's still kind of in the epidermis. It's still kind of surface. It's not an erosion. It's not an actual ulcer yet. So if you think it's going deeper, that might change what sort of dressing you put on it. But I would start, I'm going to assume that Marianne's referring to a D-roof blister. I would start with a hydrocolloid. I would make sure it's sterile. So I wouldn't use Compeed. I'd use Comfeel or Duoderm or one of our blister pod hydrocolloids because they're sterile. And then I'd just monitor it. I'd monitor it real closely. And if I thought my diabetic patient or anyone was, their blister was getting worse, I would jump in and maybe change the dressing. However, probably more important than that, or important at an earlier stage, is that we go some ways to implementing blister prevention, because you can have a brilliant dressing on there, but if you haven't made any attempt to reduce the repetitive shear deformation, that blister will get worse, it will refill, it will continue to be painful. And I can tell you that if you implement the appropriate prevention, even for a blister under the ball of the foot, in someone who has to keep running or walking, you can make that pain-free. So you just need to implement adequate prevention to stop the blister causing shear, to help it get better, to help the dressing do its thing and help that blister get better. So I hope that answers your question, Marianne. Next one was from Aloysia. What products to use and treatments either aspirate or irrigate? Personally, I don't aspirate, so I don't use a needle, a hypodermic needle or syringe, just because scalpel blades are easier for me to access, and they're lower bulk. I'm talking about when I go to races, but even in the clinic, I just use a scalpel blade. And I lance it, so rather than aspirate it. But there's no problem in aspirating. You can do that. That's completely fine. A lot of people do. If you are expecting to aspirate or lance and you get all the fluid out of the blister, you'll be surprised, even if you put like a decent sized hole in that blister roof, you'll be surprised at how quickly it heals or sticks back together, and that blister can refill if you don't implement prevention. So that's one thing to consider. A tiny little pinprick or needle prick is definitely going to heal, is going to stick back together, and that blister will refill. So implement prevention. It doesn't matter whether you lance with a scalpel or you aspirate, same difference, but implement prevention. It's important to note what you've done when you do this, when you aspirate or lance, is you've taken an intact blister, which can't get infected, into a torn blister. It might not be really torn, but that's essentially what you've done, which is fine, but it opens it up to infection. So betadine or some sort of antiseptic. In regards to irrigation, you can irrigate with normal saline. That's completely appropriate. I tend just to use betadine, but there's no problem with irrigating it. And okay, our last question. Any in the chat? Pop your question in the chat if you've got another one. But Tamara asked to lance or not to lance, and this is a very common question. To keep it as simple as possible, you wouldn't lance it if, all other things being equal, because as soon as you lance it, you open it up to infection. However, it's going to depend on a few things. It's going to depend. Hi, Marianne. It's going to depend on the person's general health. So if they're neuropathic, diabetic, all that kind of thing, you might choose not to lance rather than lance. It's going to depend on their activity level. So let's say they're running and they're only halfway. Let's say they're doing Oxfam Trail Walker and they're halfway through, so they've got another 50 Ks to go. If you don't lance it, it's pretty likely it's going to spontaneously tear anyway, and you could end up with that maceration issue that we saw. So that would be a reason to lance. But if it was, let's say, on a person that It's Friday afternoon. They've got a blister on the back of their heel. They're not doing anything for the weekend. There's no reason to lance that blister. It could completely reabsorb over the weekend, and they're right for Monday to get back into their shoes. Implement prevention, because just because it's healed doesn't mean it won't recur. Try and figure out why it happened in the first place. So yeah, it will depend on their activity and also the blister location. So again, if it's on the back of the heel or between the toes, and they're about to, it's Friday afternoon and they've got netball the next morning, it's probably not going to resolve in that time frame. So you might as well at some point lance it, deal with it in a controlled environment rather than just letting it spontaneously burst of its own accord and therefore be open to infection. But, you know, if it's somewhere on the back of their heel or under their arch and it's the weekend, there's no need to. If you don't want to, you don't have to lance it. So yeah, it depends on the blister location, the activity, their general health. It also depends on the gear they've got. So some people have, you know, they'll go to these events, or, you know, even just your average person, and at home they might not have anything to deal with it. No Band-Aids, no antiseptic even. They might have poor self-care ability. So if they really don't have the gear, or they don't know how to use it, or they can't use it because they can't see their feet, get to their feet, etc., you'd be more inclined to leave it intact. But, you know, I've seen people go to races even where blister kits are required stuff, like they have to have that gear, otherwise they can't do the race. And they've just bunged a whole bunch of stuff in a bag and they have no idea what's in there or how to use it. Yeah, so in that case, you might have to do a bit of education to tell them what they need, how to use it, so that they minimize the chance that they're going to make their blister situation worse. But in every situation, whether you lance it or not, you still need to implement prevention. Otherwise, that blister is still going to hurt. It's going to refill or get worse, become a deeper kind of an issue. So, yeah, that's all I had prepared. So if there's any other questions, you can just pop on your microphone or type your question in the chat and I'll be happy to answer it. And for those that join late, there's going to be a recording that we'll send out to you. And if you ask a question at the time of registration, we've answered it, and yeah, you'll be able to watch the replay. But if there's any other questions, let me know. And if not, then I'll sign off in a sec. Oh, this is a little handout that you can get in the free CPD part of our course site. It goes through the 5 stages of blisters and what dressings and prevention to implement at each stage. So that's available for free as a patient handout that you can print off your computer in the free CPD. Let me try and bring that up again. This one here, free CPD, enroll for free. We've got a webinar replay, and that's the PDF there. And if you'd like to get stuck into treating or addressing blisters as per their anatomical location, and you want to know all the ins and outs about the pros and cons of blister prevention strategies and how to deal with blisters per anatomical location, jump into Blister Prevention University. Is $299 US, and it has a ton of good stuff in there. And you get access forever in that, so it doesn't expire. So there are our prevention strategies and anatomical locations. All right, guys. Well, let me just check the questions again. Considering there's no other questions, I'll sign off from here. If you joined late or you're watching the recording, we're going to do this every month. I'm going to get online for half an hour, answer your questions. So you'll get an email from us. Feel free to register, ask your question at the registration process or stage, and we'll get to them during the meeting. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining. See you later.